Hello everybody, my name is Shatnus, and today I want to talk about some changes to the Tormented Affix, the new seasonal Affix that are coming out on the PTR. Actually, they came out not this most recent release candidate build, but the build earlier this week. And basically they can be summarized as mostly buffs for most of the lieutenants. And I have some mixed feelings about this, and some suggestions actually that were inspired by this Twitter exchange. I'll go through it all, but I think it's an interesting topic because I'm really pulled in two different directions by these. So you'll see, for instance, the Incinerator guy. They've buffed the aura, the Soulforged Flames aura, which both makes it a harder fight. This Incinerator by itself, it makes it so that if you ignore the Incinerator and fight the last boss with the aura instead, because that's how this affix works, right? Is you either kill the mini bosses or their aura is on the last boss. This is much more deadly now to do that, although it probably already was something that was pretty unrealistic to do. And they added a new large AoE that hits all players on a plus 10 key for about 15k, which means that if we were on something like a plus 20 key, then we're looking at something that's hitting for like 40k, right? And if we're going up to a plus 25 key, now we're looking at, in the middle of an AoE ticking damage aura, a large AoE that's just going to murder everybody. So that's something that is pretty scary for those. But on a plus 10 key, on a plus 15 key, it shouldn't be a problem. Aura's Cold Heart, they've added some swirlies to dodge while you're slowed as well. Executioner of Ruth, there's this unkickable AoE fear that you can mitigate by standing within 6 yards of an ally, or by outranging it, or by breaking line of sight. Just standing on top of an ally is going to be the way to do this, which is you need to spread from your allies a little bit for the Carnage ability, but you're going to want to be near enough to them that you can get on top for the Wave of Terror ability. Again, actually not something that's too big of a deal here, as long as you do that counterplay. And then they kind of reworked Sagadon the Breaker, which is the tank buster, to make it so that you don't kite, because it's just going to grip you back and then crush. So they've turned it into an actual tank buster instead of a kite mob, which I do think is a good idea, but it does make it hard. But I like things that are difficult, and the answer isn't just, well, it's difficult unless you kite. I'd rather things be difficult than difficult unless you kite. So that's what's going on with these mobs, which sparked some discussion on Twitter between a bunch of players that I respect on all sides here. So let's take a look at this Twitter thread. It's between Moofsy, Yoda, and then at the bottom we got a JB tweet that I'm saving for last because I think it is the best one. Moofsy here is on the position of glad they added some depth to these dudes. They were a tad dull. Hopefully the powers they drop are tuned well enough to not skip all of them. Then Yoda's on the strong disagree side. Moofsy says you'd rather have them be boring and easy to deal with. Yoda says, I think the affix was already slightly too overtuned in the previous versions. One of the best parts of M Plus is that you can create your own difficulty by combining pulls or playing trash with the affix. Making the affix too hard by itself ruins that. And then he says, this tuning pass also puts the affix into the difficulty area where you simply might not be able to kill a level 25 Incinerator without wiping using the comp you chose, for instance, if you were foolish enough to bring a Hunter. So you'll have to try the key on a 24 instead. No one wants that, which, I mean, again, this aura is going to be ticking for quite a lot, and it's doing this large AoE in the middle of that, in addition to these other effects that you're needing to play around. I could certainly see this mob being the part of the dungeon that first tells you, okay, this is not going to work with these changes, and potentially some of these other ones as well. And then JB comes in here with this genius tweet that I cannot stop thinking about, which is maybe cap Lieutenant scaling at 15, like Bursting and Grievous, which I actually kind of think they should just do this with every affix the more I've been thinking about it. So Mythic Plus affixes exist in this really weird space where they kind of serve two different masters, right? They have the people doing weekly plus 10s, weekly plus 15s, and for those players, the things that Blizzard is trying to make them do is be variety from week to week, be very impactful so the dungeon run feels, again, different from week to week, and make the mini-bosses fun and interesting to fight, right? And I think that these changes for that purpose really do a good job of doing that, right? These mobs are not going to be these boring, two ability things where, okay, stand out of the fire, dispel this, easy, right? They're making it so that, okay, even on a plus plus 10, plus 15, there's meaningful damage now coming out here. And similarly, they're adding all this stuff to these other bosses that's going to mean there's much more to do. That means fighting these things just by themselves is going to be interesting and difficult in a plus 15 key in a way that it wasn't before. But in a plus 25 key, now we're maybe thinking about, okay, we're no longer considering pulling this with a bunch of other trash, right? Which is what we were thinking about doing before, which is fun. And that's one of the best parts about high keys, is that the timer starts getting tight and you're like, okay, what can we do to go bigger here? If you think about like Prideful Season, the answer was always, well, I guess we're skipping prides, right? Because we can't fight this pride with this trash, that's ridiculous, because Prideful was tuned to such a high level. But if you think about an affix like Reaping was really, really, really fun in those high-level keys. It was a really fun affix to try and push keys against, because the answer to, okay, can we try and do something crazy here with Reaping, was always yes. So even though Reaping was this easier affix, right, it was this affix where, say, at a plus 15 key level, it was probably a lot more boring than something like Prideful or than something like Tormented. It was this affix where in high keys it was actually more interesting because it was easy enough to be combined with other pulls, right? And so I think that is actually something they should do just with every affix, is cap the scaling at the 15 level, the 18 level, the 20 level, wherever it makes the numbers good for them. You could even make it so that it just stops scaling as hard, right? The slope could go down in terms of how much health and damage these mobs gain in particular past 15. And then you get to preserve this element of them being interesting mini-bosses to fight by themselves in a plus 15 key, because that's what people are going to do, right? In a plus 15 key, people will just fight the affix by itself, and so you need to make it interesting to do that. Even if you make it easier, they're not just going to pull trash onto these mobs. They're going to fight by themselves, and maybe one tank out of 10 is going to try and pull them onto other trash, and then if they wipe, that tank's going to get yelled at, going to get flamed, and so that's not something that's common in plus 15 keys, right? But as you start getting to the high keys and you start getting this pressure of, hey, we're doing this hard content, we want to find ways to save time, that's where you start getting this question of, like, is this even mathematically possible, right? Like, when you're thinking about trying to do, like, a 25 key, one of the scariest things you're thinking about in Season 1 is just the prideful mobs by themselves, right? And that means that instead of these dungeons being about all of these different pulls and all of these different possibilities, it actually really condenses it down to, okay, how are we going to deal with this pride? Are we going to skip this one? Which prideful buffs do we need for bosses? Okay, we're fighting this pride by itself. We got to make sure that we spawn it perfectly. We come in with full mana, and then it's not like those pride fights are interesting, right? There's just like a lot of numbers being thrown at you. And I think that's true for these as well. Even though there's more mechanics than pride has, it's still not as many mechanics as fighting, a half as strong version of this with a full-size trash pull, which is what you'd do if the affix was easier. So that's my suggestion for this. That's my hope for what they should do with just this, and actually a lot of affixes, I think, is just make it so that they stay at this level where they're interesting and fun and difficult on a plus 15, and then let them get out of the way as the key level gets higher, and make it so that you can start combining pulls and doing pulls together, because you need to do that to beat the timer, and that makes things really fun. That's the best part about M+. From my perspective, is when the seasonal affix, instead of just being about, like, hey, there's these 4 mini-bosses that you're going to fight, and each of them is this hard fight, and keys are kind of capped this season by what level you wipe to Incinerate or Arcaloth at. Instead, it's like, hey, there's not just these 4 mini-boss fights, right? Every dungeon, there's this question of, like, which of these mini-bosses are you going to fight with trash? How are you going to pull that off? What are you pulling them with? Which ones are you pulling with trash? All of these questions that are really interesting, and fights that are actually more intense and hectic than just fighting these by themselves with high numbers. Those are just kind of pure numbers checks, and not these hectic, you've got 5 trash mobs and a boss experience, which are really fun and great in high keys, but again, people are not going to do those in plus 15 keys, so they shouldn't try and encourage that, right? The thing about, like, Reaping Season, that was something that didn't happen in those low keys, right? People didn't pull Reaping with trash, they just fought the Reaping by itself, and I think that was the criticism that people did have for Reaping was, this is kind of easy if we're taking it slow and steady. Anyways, that's just my thoughts, all inspired by this JP tweet. I recommend following JP on Twitter. That's a good move for a lot of tweets that will make you think. I don't agree with all his tweets ever, but I almost all of them I think are really interesting, so I check that out. Anyways, I hope you like this video. There's been some other changes to Tormented as well. They've been rebalancing some of the anima powers, but I don't really have too much standing to talk about that, so I'm not gonna. But if you want to read more about it, there's some Wowhead articles and stuff. I'll maybe add them in the description below. Thanks for watching. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.